In 1788, panic spread throughout London. People were even fearful of leaving their homes. Crime was at an all-time high, with pickpockets, highwaymen and burglars lurking around every corner. The police force, if you could even call it that, was lacking to say the least. And my goodness, were they woefully unprepared for the horrifically chilling events that would soon unfold. One man, a monster, would terrorise the streets of London and strike fear into men and women alike. One May evening in 1788, Maria Smith was on her way to visit her friend who lived near Fleet Street, and this was only a short walk away. As it wasn't far and the evening was young, she thought she'd be safe to go alone. As Maria walked, the sky began to darken, quicker than she'd hoped, and the crowds in the streets began to dwindle. Soon it became very, very quiet. She started to feel a bit uneasy. The streets weren't well lit, and she had no one with her for protection. She thought she heard someone or something. She looked behind her, but nothing. She shrugged it off and continued on. However, it soon became clear that she was not, in fact, alone. A thin man with a narrow face and a cocked hat was now walking very closely behind her. He began to hurl abuse at her. Oh, and the language he used. It was scandalous, thoroughly indecent, truly vulgar. Maria's cheeks flushed. She put her head down and started to walk more quickly, hoping to shake the man off. But the strange man's pursuit of her continued on, and so did his tirade of vulgar language. Eventually, Maria had had enough. She bravely turned around, looked him straight in the eyes, and firmly told him to leave her alone. He did not respond in the way she'd expected, though. Instead of apologising and leaving her be, he stood there in silence, grinning at her menacingly. This made her even more uneasy. She began walking away from him as fast as she could, but his pace quickened too. Out of breath, she finally arrived at her destination, and she frantically knocked at the door. As the door was opening, the man suddenly jumped up on the step next to her. He lunged at her with something sharp, driving it first into her left breast and then into her left thigh. She collapsed into the arms of the servant who was opening the door. The man did not run away. Instead, he stood looking at her, basking in the glory of his attack. The servant quickly closed and bolted the door. Luckily, Maria's thick and sturdy clothing had saved her from any real harm, but the mental anguish the attack caused would be crippling for her. Maria Smith would be the first of many, many victims. The London monster's reign of terror had begun, and his vicious attacks were nothing like the city had seen before. Panic and fear would spread throughout London like wildfire. Reports of attacks by the monster started to come flooding in. These grew in frequency throughout 1789 and peaked in 1790. The celebrations for Queen Charlotte's birthday provided plenty of opportunities for the monster, as women returned home from the wonderful balls and parties. The victims would include the two beautiful Porter sisters, Anne Porter and Sarah Porter, who will play an important part in the story later on. He followed them whilst shouting abusive language. He then yelled, "Ho ho, is that you?" and hit Sarah on the back of the head with such force that she lost her balance and teetered forwards. The two sisters ran towards the house and began banging on the front door. The monster followed though. He ran up behind them and slashed Anne Porter on the hip. Once again, he did not run away. He was the model of composure, standing there, grinning, taking in his achievement. John Porter, their brother, eventually opened the door and he helped his two sisters into the house. Anne's dress was in tatters and completely soaked with blood on one side. The wound, stretching from her bottom to her thigh, was 6 inches long and 3 inches deep. They sent some servants to hunt for the monster, but unfortunately he had already disappeared into the night. For a while, his attacks would follow the same pattern. He would hurl abuse at women before slashing through their clothes to the skin underneath. His non-vulgar catchphrases deserve a particular mention, I think. They were, "Buh?"
Buh? What does that even mean?
I'm not sure, to be honest, but he liked to say it. Others were, "Blast you, is that you?" and "Oh ho, is that you?" He started to become a little more adventurous. He began fastening sharp implements to his knees. He would then grab women from behind and then knee them in the bottom with his contraption. The knee contraption wasn't enough for him though. Oh no, he had to get even more inventive. His next cunning tactic was to conceal something sharp in a nosegay, a small bunch of flowers that usually smelled beautiful. He would then ask unsuspecting women to smell the nosegay. As they leaned in to inhale the sweet aroma, he would then stab them in the face. But his nosegay was made out of artificial flowers, so his success with this was limited. Women were smart, they could tell that the flowers were fake. The final iteration of his attacks was clawing women with a wolverine-esque like contraption that had 5 blades or prongs. In early 1790, John Angerstein, a very rich insurance broker, for Lloyd's no less, heard the news about the monster attacks. He was outraged by the crimes, and so he decided to visit each of the victims to gather their accounts. He found that there had been at least 30 attacks on poor unsuspecting women. Out of the kindness of his heart, he opened a subscription to raise a reward for the capture of that inhuman monster. The reward would total a hefty £100, which was a huge amount of money back then. He had posters printed and these were plastered all over London. Amateur monster hunters and vigilante groups would patrol the streets on the lookout for any man that seemed a little bit suspicious. No man was safe without a woman on his arm. If someone wanted to, just out of pure spite, they could point at you and shout, "It's the monster!" A relentless mob would then descend on you, leaving you a bloody, beaten mess. Pickpockets cleverly used this to their advantage. And there were also many false arrests because people really wanted that reward. A no monster club was formed and they all wore cardboard badges proclaiming that they were not the monster. Not really sure how they determined who should be in this club or if it kept them safe though. The press would have a field day. The papers were filled with the monster's latest attacks and ridiculous satirical images of the man. The victims became like celebrities with crowds clamouring to see them. The monster was a man of taste. You see, he predominantly attacked young, beautiful women that were very fashionable. Women began faking attacks to gain attention and make it clear to the whole of London that they fit the monster's very exacting criteria. There was even a play about him and his entire fiendish career, aptly titled The Monster. It was always a sellout with the playhouse filled to the brim. It even had musical numbers. No one could seem to settle on what the monster looked like though. He was a pale, thin, middle-sized man. He had dark hair, he also had light hair. He was a tall, stout officer in uniform. He was very tall, around 6 feet, and elegantly dressed. He was also very short and shabbily dressed.
Maybe he was grey? With wings?
No, Gargi, you were 100% not the London Monster. People suggested that he wore many layers of clothing and could just peel them off to avoid detection. That he had a vast collection of wigs and also false noses, and that he wore stilt-like heels to appear very tall on occasion. Perhaps there were many monsters working together, or maybe there were copycats going around. Women, of course, found ways to protect their precious bottoms. They used copper cuirasses, cork rumps, and even porridge pots. On Sunday the 13th of June, Anne Porter, remember her from earlier? She was one of the beautiful Porter sisters. Well, she decided to take a lovely evening stroll around St James's Park with her mother, 2 of her sisters and a fishmonger, John Coleman. As they were walking, Anne froze. Her face turned white and she called out, "There he is, the wretch!" She almost fainted, but John held her up. She had spotted the monster. "That's him in blue and buff," she called out. The surge of emotions at seeing the monster was clearly too much and she collapsed into her sister's arms. Now, John was quite besotted with the lovely Anne, and he wanted to make a good impression. So he set off to stalk the monster. He was quite a timid fellow, shall we say, and so he very quietly followed the monster at a safe distance, making no attempts to confront him. This carried on for quite a while, and he almost gave up on a few occasions. The suspect was likely very confused as to why John was following him, but he didn't try to run or anything like that. John started to work up a bit more courage. He tried to behave as obnoxiously as possible and carry out gestures of offence. He even went so far as trying out one of the monster's catchphrases. He leaned over the man's shoulder and cried out "Bah!" as loud as he could. The suspect must have thought that John was a right weirdo. He ignored him and quickened his pace. Finally, the suspect reached their destination and was let inside. John, feeling rather courageous, banged on the door. After a while, he too was let in, and he demanded to know the suspect's name. Eventually, he was given it. It was Mr. Vinnick Williams of Jermyn Street. It would turn out that the two actually knew each other. They'd met many times at public houses and the like. John left the house with the monster's name in hand, feeling very proud. Then it dawned on him. What if the man had lied about his name and address? He ran off in search of the monster again, and miraculously, he somehow found him. He brought Williams before the Porter sisters, and they proclaimed that he was indeed the monster. The Bow Street runners, an early sort of police force, was sent for, and Williams was taken into custody. So, who was this Mr. Vinnick Williams? Well, he was 23 years old, 5 foot 6 inches tall, and apparently not unpleasant looking. His father was a decently educated apothecary, but unfortunately he died quite young, and the family began to struggle financially. Vinnick had quite an interesting career. He had been a dancer at an opera house, a theatre violinist, and more recently an artificial flower maker. He had fallen on hard times though. His employment at the flower factory was terminated, and he was forced to live in a public house called the George, where he shared the same bed as another man. The press spun some rather scandalous stories with that little tidbit, but the fact was all the penniless lodgers there had to share beds. His work making artificial flowers was a little bit suspicious. Remember the nosegay tactic? He was also known to be a bit of a pest, harassing women and randomly asking for their hand in marriage. But, quite importantly, no knives, rapiers or other cutting contraptions were found in his possession. Now, I think it's time to give you a little introduction to the legal landscape at the time. Crimes were divided into felonies and misdemeanours. Felonies were very serious and punishable by death or being shipped off to a penal colony somewhere very far away. Misdemeanours were pretty minor and punishable by public flogging, the pillory, or perhaps some time in prison. Now, common assault like the monster's crimes, even if you intended to injure or kill the person, was a misdemeanour. The City of London were baying for the monster's blood though. A misdemeanour charge just simply wouldn't do. There would be huge public outcry. And so, magistrates scoured the current legislation to see if there was anything that could make the monster's crimes a felony. Eventually, they stumbled upon a little gem, a statute from 1721. You see, back then, weavers were very unhappy that people were importing wonderful clothes and fabrics from India instead of buying their own, probably very boring beige stuff. So, what did they do? Well, they tried to spoil the clothes of these fabulously dressed people by throwing acid on the clothes or cutting them with a sharp knife. This statute made it a felony to assault any person in the public streets with the intent to tear, spoil, cut, or deface the garments or clothes of such person. So, perhaps the monster could be charged under this statute. Some judges thought that he could, but I think it's pretty clear that his intent was to cut the skin underneath, and the clothes were just very annoyingly in the way. Despite the fact that many victims of the monster were adamant that Vinnick Williams was not the man who attacked them, he was still put on trial. And what an absolutely diabolical trial it would be. Some had even likened it to a pantomime. Hate for the monster was so intense that on the way to the trial, the van that Vinnick was transported in had to make its way through throngs of very, very angry people. They were armed to the teeth with stones and bats, they were booing and hissing, they wanted this man to pay, preferably with his life. Anne Porter was the first to give evidence. She appeared in court wearing a veil to shield herself from the monster's profane glances. In response to Anne's testimony, Vinnick's solicitor stated how much he sympathised with her and that he only questioned her because it was his duty. Poor Vinnick's heart sank as he heard this. It was clear that his own solicitor thought he was guilty. Throughout the trial, the audience stared at him with contempt, and he cowered as they booed and they hurled abuse at him. In contrast, the audience applauded when Anne spoke. Several victims of the monster were ready to give evidence that he was not the man who attacked them. But his legal counsel was clearly very useless, as they didn't call on any of them to give evidence. But what luck! One victim came forward to give evidence completely on her own accord. Lady Wallace. She agreed that she would testify that Vinnick was not the monster. But, and you just couldn't make it up, just before it was time to testify, she confessed that the whole thing was just one of her little jokes. She'd never even been attacked by the monster. She just wanted a good seat at the trial right in the front, as it would be thoroughly entertaining to see that little wretched man being convicted. Now, the crux of Vinnick's defence was that he was actually working on the night that Anne Porter was attacked. His employer and several of his colleagues vouched for him, confirming that he left the factory at midnight, and Anne Porter was attacked at around 11 p.m. 17 people would also vouch for his good character. And then Lady Wallace would strike again. She started passing notes around the courtroom stating that Vinnick's employer had threatened her on a number of occasions, and he was the monster. Anne's legal counsel for some reason took this seriously and asked Lady Wallace to testify. But once again she admitted that it was just one of her little jokes, and she was absolutely thrilled that it had been taken so seriously. Despite all the evidence in Vinnick's favour, the jury pronounced him guilty of attacking women with the intent to tear their clothes, a felony. If he'd attacked them with the intent to murder them, it would have just been a mere misdemeanour. Just boggles the mind, really.
Wait, so the safety of clothes was more important than people's lives?
Yep, that pretty much sums it up.
What nonsense. Buh, I say.
Luckily, the judge was a bit dubious about this decision. He deferred the sentencing to December, as he felt they needed to wait for the council of 12 judges to consider the case as well. The second trial was almost as bad as the first. Vinnick had a slightly better lawyer though, Theophilus Swift, and he was convinced of Vinnick's innocence. Unfortunately, his tactic was to try and discredit Anne's character, but she was so well loved in the community, so his plan didn't work. He also might have convinced Vinnick to dye his hair a darker colour to look less like the man Anne described, but it was quite obvious, and this just made him seem all the more guilty. Unfortunately for Vinnick, he was found guilty of attacking women with the intent to murder. Luckily though, this was a misdemeanour. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison. He served the full sentence and was released on the 16th of December 1796. He married an Elizabeth Robbins on the 22nd of February 1797, and they would go on to have a lovely son. There's no record of Vinnick Williams following his marriage. It's thought that he changed his name to Henry and that he continued his work as an artificial florist. So, was Vinnick the monster? Well, I'm not so sure. Some suggest that Anne and John conspired together to get their hands on that £100 reward. John did get the money, and also some other private rewards. The two married shortly after the trial. Suspicious, eh? Especially because during the trial they were adamant that they were not an item. On the other hand, the attacks did stop after Vinnick was put in prison. Was there even a monster at all? There were most definitely some attacks, but monster mania was fueled by Angerstein's reward. The monster was all over the papers, it was plastered on posters, and some people were even faking attacks. It was also a time of high stress and uncertainty in Britain. There was the Gordon riots, and the French Revolution impacted the whole of Europe. And crime was at an all-time high in London. This was the perfect breeding ground for mass psychogenic illness. Time for a shameless plug. I've got a fab video on the deadly dancing plague. A story so bizarre you'd never believe it was true, and another potential case of mass psychogenic illness. To this day, the identity of the monster, if there ever was one, remains a mystery, and it's one that we'll likely never solve. If you'd like more curious, dark and mysterious tales, take a look at some of my other videos. Stay safe, don't forget to wear a porridge pot to protect your precious derriere, and I hope you have a magnificent day.